Ibrahim Zuera Mohammed. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for the opportunity to make this statement in relation to the upcoming ordinary session of the Assembly of the African Union. Mr. Speaker, the heads of states and government of the member states of the African Union will gather for the 38th ordinary session of the Assembly of the Union on 15th to 16th February 2025 in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. This annual gathering, Mr. Speaker, of the leaders of the AU is preceded by the Permanent Representatives Committee meetings and the Executive Council meetings. Mr. Speaker, this year's assembly is significant for Ghana because the AU Assembly, through its decision 884 of 2024, designated the theme of the year for the 2024 as, and I quote, "Justice for Africans and People of African Descent Through Reparations," unquote. Mr. Speaker, the Assembly Decision 884 was to implement the outcome of the Accra Reparations Conference of November 2023, which was co-organized by the African Union Commission and the government of Ghana. The outcome document of the Accra Reparations Conference is the Accra Proclamations on Reparations. Mr. Speaker, at the 37th ordinary session of the Assembly of the Union in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, from 17th to 18th February 2024, the Assembly adopted the decision of delegates who participated in the Accra Reparations Conference from 14th to 17th November 2023 in Accra, Ghana, and expressed their appreciation to the government of Ghana and the African Union for co-organizing and conducting the conference. They acknowledge the invaluable statements of heads of the AU and for the support and contribution provided by the Union to the conference. They recognize that the Accra Reparations Conference, which was convened with a shared commitment to addressing historical injustices and injurious crimes committed against Africans and the people of African descent through transatlantic enslavement, colonization, and apartheid, to address the inequities present in the international economic and political orders as a demonstration of the African Union's commitment to advancing the cause of reparatory justice and healing for Africans and for all people of African descent. Mr. Speaker, the Accra Reparations Conference was therefore in fulfillment of the decision 884 taken in February 2023 at the 36th ordinary session of the Assembly of Heads of States and Government of the African Union, endorsing the government of Ghana's proposal to co-organize with relevant stakeholders and host an international conference towards, I quote, "building a united front to advance the cause of justice and the payment of reparations to Africans," unquote. The Accra Proclamation on Reparations had proposed the establishment of certain mechanisms for the institutionalization of the reparation agenda in Africa. The mechanisms include, Mr. Speaker, 1. The President of Ghana was appointed by the Assembly as the champion on reparations. 2. Committee of Experts on Reparations to develop an African common position on reparations. 3. Reference group of legal experts to work in close coordination with the African Union, led by the Commission and including the judicial and quasi-judicial organs of the Union. 4. Global Reparations Fund based in Africa to work in collaboration with the African Union to advance the campaign of the African Union on reparations. And finally, Mr. Speaker, Transcontinental Partnership Framework embracing the AU, CARICOM, and the African diaspora in Latin America, North America, Europe, and UK, and elsewhere in the world to build a strong common front among them in pursuit of reparations and reparatory justice at the global level. Mr. Speaker, His Excellency President John Dramani Mahama, in his capacity as champion for the theme of the year 2025 on reparations, will therefore be presenting a report to the Assembly of the Union after the official launch of the theme of the year. This year's AU Assembly will also, inter alia, appoint the new chairperson of the AU Commission and the new deputy chairperson, as well as confirm the elections of the new 6 incoming commissioners. I thank you, Mr. Speaker, for this opportunity to make this statement in anticipation of a grand meeting of the Union. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. The floor is now Honorable Kojo Nkrumah.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for the opportunity to comment on the statement that was just delivered to this House. And as African leaders gather for the 38th ordinary session of the Assembly of the African Union, we send to them our best wishes to take the right decisions that will support the continent. Mr. Speaker, however, specific to the matter of reparations, if the world, particularly the West, is interested or is minded to pay reparations for participating in the ills associated with the transatlantic slave trade, so be it. And I don't think anybody can quarrel with that. But I think from an African perspective, the subject needs some further examination. The transatlantic slave trade was not end-to-end executed by people of Western descent only. Africans participated in it. In fact, if you go to the Elmina Castle, you will find recognitions of the participation of Africans in the transatlantic slave trade. You also find from our history how we indulged in intertribal slavery even before the white man came here. So if today we are looking to have a conversation about reparations as the way to cure the injustices, it raises questions about whether we are also going to consider paying intertribal reparations. But Mr. Speaker, more to the point, the justice that is being sought, in my honest view, needs to be directed towards other areas than reparations. For example, the African Union has been talking about setting up strong African financial institutions to mobilize resources to help the advancement of Africa. My view is that it is a more practical and near immediate way to mobilize resources to help advance the African cause as against the subject of reparations. Mr. Speaker, we've also just spent a lot of time and resources pushing what they call the Continental Free Trade Area, setting up its office here in Ghana. There's been a lot of talk about it, but very little trade ongoing. If African leaders are looking at ways of deepening what they call justice for the African people, I think that's another area which is practical, is real, it can be facilitated, instead of expecting a group of Western countries to write checks for us for their participation in an exercise that we ourselves were even doing and we participated in as Africans. And finally, Mr. Speaker, there's also the need for more South-South trade to empower Africans. A lot of young people in Africa are looking for opportunity for African leaders to open up borders for trade and employment across Africa. If African leaders are going to spend time talking about reparations from the West for their participation in slave trade, I think it will be good for them to also include in this conversation how they can fast-track efforts to open up our borders and open up things like South-South trade. These, in my view, are more realistic ways to get justice for today's generation of Africans, as against what appears to be a nice theoretical conversation of reparations from the rest, from the West. We were doing this very evil act among ourselves. We participated in it, which, because a white man didn't go into the villages to go and pick Africans and put them on the boats. Africans participated in picking black people up and selling them to the white man. So we have a responsibility on our own to take immediate practical steps, as we have mouthed in times past, to provide justice for our own people. So as the African leaders gather to discuss reparations, I believe that these are things that they should consider as part of that exercise. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. Honourable Member.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Respectfully, I would want to continue from where my brother left off, especially when he said that that nice theoretical conversation should be put aside. We should ensure that we put up practical reasons or practical means of uplifting ourselves as Africans than coming together, always sitting and talking about reparation. What are we, African leaders, doing to ourselves as a people? For me, I believe that Africa is endowed with the natural and human resources that can be harnessed for the betterment of its people, rather than always having conversations about reparations. Who are we going to take the money from? Mr. Speaker, I believe that in this time and age, we still have the natural resources all across Africa. We still have the human resources that if our leaders have the political will to better the lot of we, the Africans ourselves, we will be able to do it. We will be able to lift ourselves from that quagmire of poverty. Just now, we were lamenting the minority leader brought up a statement about cholera in his place. And my brother, the other time, one of us also raised the issue about meningitis. But Lord, these are some of the things that we should look at solving the problem. And I was happy when the minority chief whip said that it is unpardonable. Our people are dying. Our people are dying from poverty. Our leaders must sit up. Our leaders must look at harnessing our natural resources for our betterment. So for me, yes, it is good. They may decide, talk about it. But back home, we have things. We have our resources. We have our gold, manganese, whatever. Instead, for example, looking at our country, we export raw materials. What do our people need? What we need is work. So I would add my voice to the maker of the statement. Yes, we appreciate them. We appreciate whatever they are doing. But we also want to plead with them that they should look back home. They shouldn't just think about reparations. We have the resources here. We can put them together for our betterment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I give the floor to Honorable Sosu.
Thank you very much, Right Honorable Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank Honorable Zuera for such a very important reminder of reparation. And Mr. Speaker, to also contribute to say that as African leaders gather to look at this discussion, they need to be reminded that what Africans need today is not a reparation in the form of a handout. It is not a reparation in the form that could be described as a charity model, where Africa is treated as an object of scorn or an object of pity, where world leaders will now be looking at Africa as if we are at their beck and call. Mr. Speaker, Africa has a population of over 1.5 billion people. We are so youthful when it comes to our population. Mr. Speaker, I dare say that there are several research materials that shows that any corporation which is not based on economics does not yield any outcome. And my Lord, Mr. Speaker, you can, Mr. Speaker, you can look at the Organization of African Union, which metamorphosed into AU, and look at all the attempts made at the regional levels with the kind of what we call the spaghetti approach of integration that we have on the continent. Mr. Speaker, when you look at what is happening, it is the reason why we have not advanced. Remember that we have the Lagos Plan of Action, we have the Abuja Treaty. All these treaties and plan of actions were based on how we can use economics to transform Africa. And it is because of that that today we have the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. Mr. Speaker, not until Africa wakes up, if our leaders do not wake up to really come together with, at the table as far as this Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is concerned, Mr. Speaker, we are not going anywhere. If you look at how the coal and steel factories cooperation began in Europe, only a trade area, small trade area between France and Germany today is what we call the European Union. So if Africa can move from trade integration, removing our barriers and tariff and non-tariff barriers, liberalizing our market, having a common market, having a common monetary union, eventually having an economic union, there is no way we will come out of this quagmire. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to use this platform to draw the attention of the world leaders, the African leaders, as they gather to deliberate our reparation. That the reparation we need today is emancipation from mental slavery. Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our mind. This is what we need. This is the only way we can come out of our quagmire. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for giving me the opportunity to contribute.
Thank you. Thank you, Honorable Patrick Yabwama.
Yeah, man.
So is Irie. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let me add my voice to the comment, to the statement ably made by my colleague from Salaga South. Mr. Speaker, our colleagues have drawn our attention to how poor we've traded amongst ourselves in Africa. African global trade share is just 3% and is very, very low and poor. To the extent that we want to increase investment in Africa and create more job opportunities. So, Speaker, I would want our leaders to reconsider the theme for this year's AU summit, if they can. Looking at the issues around the world lately, Mr. Speaker, President Trump has signed a lot of executive orders, some affecting African nationals. And I believe this is the time for African leaders to have gone to Addis Ababa to consider the implications of what President Trump has done with regards to the nationals of Africa. Not to be talking about reparations, Mr. Speaker. We've been talking about reparations for many years, and we've achieved nothing. And I believe we are not going to achieve anything. There are issues in Congo, DRC, between Rwanda, between South Africa. Soldiers are being killed here and there. Those are issues that bother the African today. Nigeria is the biggest economy in Africa, Mr. Speaker. Nigeria is seeking to join the BRICS, like South Africa did. You have countries in ECOWAS leaving to form other unions outside ECOWAS. Those are matters that affect us, that must agitate the thinking and thoughts of African leaders. Should they meet in Addis? I don't know when they are meeting, Mr. Speaker. So I believe that there are very important issues other than talking about reparations. The Global Reparation Fund was to have been set up, I think, last year. I don't think we even have $1 in that account. Yet we are going to be sitting in Addis Ababa with delegations upon delegations from countries, about 55 countries in Africa, to go to Addis Ababa and read speeches with no effect on the people on the continent. That is why the youth of Africa are constantly losing interest in our politics and democracy and will fall for anything. Today I read on that there are some Ghanaians even fighting alongside the jihadists or whatever in the Sahelian areas across country in the north, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger. Ghanaians participated in the, what do you call it? Those people who were cutting people's limbs and arms. No Boko Haram in Europe. So, Mr. Speaker, I believe there are very critical issues that should agitate the minds of the 21st century African leaders. Our trade, we talked about a common payment platform. We talked about a common air transportation system is very bad. You want to travel from here to Guinea to Sierra Leone and you have to go to 3 other countries. Those are the things that we have to be talking about. Our road networks are not linked properly. So how can we talk about trade and be part of global trade, Mr. Speaker? So I believe that we should reconsider this theme for the AU summit in Addis if it's not too late, and to talk about those critical matters that will spur up our economic growth and to ensure that Africa becomes a leading light in the world. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. I recognize James Agalga, Honorable.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to commend the maker of the statement, which simply calls for reparation in view of certain disturbing historical occurrences, such as the transatlantic slave trade. Mr. Speaker, the fundamental question is whether or not it is justifiable for Africans to be asking for reparation at this point in our history. I heard one of our colleagues, the Honorable Kojo Oppong-Nkrumah, argue in relation to this statement that in the course of the conduct of the transatlantic slave trade, Africans participated. That is a historical fact. But is that enough justification for us to say it is not proper for us to be talking about reparation? Mr. Speaker, I think we need to set the records straight. The narrative that Africans participated in the conduct of the slave trade, for which reason we shouldn't be talking about reparation, is the Western narrative. The facts are very clear. Those Africans who participated in the conduct of the slave trade were induced. In fact, historical accounts have it that following the advent of the transatlantic slave trade, the face of warfare in Africa changed for the West. Wars became very brutal because we had been induced into thinking that some humans were less human than others, and so some ethnic groups could afford to capture their own kind and sell them into slavery. I think we should be guided by the works of Walter Rodney, and he wrote a book entitled How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. I will recommend that masterpiece to all of us. If we read Walter Rodney, Mr. Speaker, we would come to terms with the fact that our underdevelopment was induced by imperial Europe. They started with the slave trade, and when they had no use for slavery again because machines had now been invented, they switched to the mode of what? Colonialism. Today, colonialism has taken another form. Nkrumah described that as neo-colonialism. So let us not talk about collaboration on the part of some Africans. Because even when the Holocaust was committed, there were some Jewish groups which collaborated with Adolf Hitler and his ilk. With those few words, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to commend the maker of the statement and to indicate clearly in very strong terms that we have sufficient justification to demand for the payment of reparation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity.
Thank you, Honorable Gisela Tete. Then I'll come to leadership.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I'm trying to get the formula you are using. It appears to me that you are doing, what it appears to me you do 2 on their side and 1 on our side. As regard, it is becoming consistent. I'm just seeking your guidance. I'm just seeking your kind guidance. If it is the case that, with all due respect, I know you are very experienced in these matters. Is it the case that you are using a certain ratio that we are not aware of? If you can carry us along.
Honorable Minority Whip, sometimes I look at the number of people on their feet and I try to balance the equation.
Thank you for being definite that it is not a ratio that I was thinking, but it's members catching your attention. We'll try and catch your attention there.
Honorable Gisela Tete, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've learned to manage my expectations when it comes to the discussion on restitution, reparations, and restoration. Let me give a little example. In my little constituency, well, not a little constituency, in my constituency of Autu Senya West, I have a fort called Fort Good Hope, which was built by the Dutch. And so one day, I decided to pay a visit to the Dutch embassy to have a discussion with the ambassador. And I said, oh, I have a fort in my place. I want to see what collaborations can be done with the fort in terms of tourism. I'd also read an article on Reuters that said that the Dutch PM, Mark Rutte, at the time, had apologized for the Dutch involvement in slavery. So I felt that was a good time to have it open up and have a discussion on my little fort sitting in Senya Breku. The PM had also indicated that they are not interested in reparations, but they will set up a 200 million euro education fund in lieu of that. And so I thought that I could tap into that education fund for my community of Senya Breku because the Fort Good Hope stands there as a relic up till today. I was disappointed when he said, actually, it was meant more for the colonies. So I said, oh, but there was an origin and there was a destination. The destination is the colonies, but the origin is the African coast. In Central region, there are over 17 or more forts and castles, and the evidence is there, even towards Ahanta, the cruel story of Bedu Bonsu, the second and all. So there's a long history of the Dutch involvement along our coast. I'm just using this as an example because it's a practical example for me. So I just realized that, okay, can I tap into the education fund as well? 200 million euro can do something. Can there be some technology transfer? Can I have a school built in my community by the Dutch? But I realized that the discussion was not going to go far. So at that point, I decided to advise myself. So much as I thank the speaker, the writer of this statement, I personally manage my expectations. And I think that as Africans, we must also go in with expectation management. Because somebody may not be on the same meter band as you are and thinking in the same terms of what sort of reparations. I don't think we want handouts, but I'm sure that some economic cooperation would do. Technology transfers would do. Access to education funds that were set up. This is just the Dutch example I've given you. There may be others along the way that have also done some kind of interventions. But I think that it should be more along those lines. So that the reality is that when, as we sit in here in this house, that we all represent a constituency, the ripple effect of that will be felt in a constituency like mine, where I have a relic built by the Dutch, every day reminding me of their presence. And I think that that discussion should link with tourism and others and make sure that at least the people who are affected by the slave trade, I wonder whether there will ever be closure, but at least there should be some discussion along those lines. But we are not there to beg, but I'm sure that at least some cooperation, technology transfer, as I said, or something more practical and pragmatic and beneficial to us as a people is something that at least we would not mind tapping into. I would like to translate all this into a benefit to my constituency, and I'm sure all of us who have such relics in our constituencies may want to do the same. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minority Leadership.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I commend the maker of this statement. Mr. Speaker, I have different views with reference to reparation in Africa. And it has to do with the fact that, Mr. Speaker, a friend once told me that if a ship was brought to the Tema port and people are asked whether or not they want to travel to America, and that they will be charged before traveling to America. Mr. Speaker, you and I know that a lot of people will jump onto that ship and travel to America. Mr. Speaker, the issues about reparation, whether or not we mean to deal with them, is a matter for us to think through carefully. What does reparatory justice for Africa entail? Does it entail we looking at a range of initiatives and how we intend to deal with these initiatives? Are we looking at historically acknowledging that we were once under the colonial spell? And are we willing to be compensated for those? Does it also entail we looking for financial reparations, some amount of money that will be paid as compensation to Africans that had to go through whatever reparations we went through? Does it also entail land restitutions, those lands which were taken from us? Are we willing to accept those lands and to take them and to walk away? Are we all thinking about these policy issues of policy reforms, including now departing from issues of social inequalities and discrimination? There are a host of issues we are dealing with as Africans. I think that I take a cue from my friend, Honorable Francis Xavier, that are we willing to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery? Are we willing to depart from the fact that we won't go and sit at one place applying for visa, and we know that the sun is scorching, there is no proper arrangements for people who even are applying and paying so much to travel to another country? Are we willing to depart from that? Within our same Africa, are we not getting the kind of discrimination we see every now and then, that even if you're going to a place like Morocco or Algeria, you don't see yourself as an African? Are we willing to also deal with the real issues of, say that from today, whatever we are due as Africans, we will treat ourselves as Africans? Honorable Patrick Boama made the call about when you are even traveling within Africa, and even in cases when you are supposed to procure some visas before you can get to your destination within Africa. And even the issue of transportation within Africa. You can best understand that sometimes when you're even traveling to Ivory Coast and how you go and land in Ivory Coast, what is happening to AU and what is happening to EU within this shortest possible time? I think that as Africans, we must rise up to the occasion. We should stop just doing the theories and rhetorics and rise up to the core. Maybe that is also an occasion to say that Kwame Nkrumah did one of the best things by pushing for Africanization. But are we still willing to do it the way we think about it? Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. The indication is that I recognize Honorable Minority Chief Whip, Honorable Anodon Pre.
Speaker, I am exceedingly grateful. I'm exceedingly grateful for your indulgence. So we are not to sound repetitive. I think colleagues have put matters in context, not according to any order. I've listened to my deputy, Honorable Ahmed, Honorable Sosu, my good friend, and the Honorable Buama. One thing comes to mind. Reparation, obviously, is not a beautiful thing to go for. It is not a low-hanging fruit that we can go for as a continent. Clearly, it cuts some doubts in terms of shadow on us as the independent, God-given people. It's not something we should be proud of. Reparation is out of the question. We should probably forcefully go out there and make a call for removal of trade tariffs and trade barriers. And that will set the stage for equal exchanges in terms of trade between Africa and ourselves and the other parts of the world. Speaker, it is strange that Africans are eager to trade with Europe in the face of the yawning gap. We have the Mediterranean Sea creating us a problem, a yawning gap, yet we feel more comfortable to trade with our brothers in Europe, whilst we can trade better amongst ourselves as Africans. Speaker, we've been talking about African Union, the continent coming together way ahead of the European Union. Before the Europeans started talking about their union, European Union, Africans have started talking about the unity of Africa and the African Union long ago. What happened? Along the line, today the European Union is much stronger in terms of geopolitics, and is doing better in terms of welfare, seeking welfare, and staging advocacy for trade and the development and changing the paradigm of development of Europe. They are way ahead of us. Speaker, I dare say that even before the Marshall Plan, Africans were on the path of progress and unity. After Europe was zeroed down by Hitler and Americans and co came together to put out the Marshall Plan, Africans were already talking about unity. And our torchbearers have always been talking about this. It's sad we are where we are, and today reparation becomes a subject matter of discussion. With greatest respect to our colleague, reparation should be pushed to the back burner. It cannot be. It cannot be. We cannot be satisfied with reparation. What we need is equal exchange in terms of trade. Today, one can recall all the economic interventions in Africa, PAMSCAD, Economic Recovery Program, and all the likes. All these interventions have not helped ultimately. And so our torchbearers could not have been far from right when they said that Africans must take their destiny in our hands. And I couldn't have agreed more with Honorable Buama when he says we are going there to talk about theories again. And here I think individual African countries must rise up. And in our context, we can send a message through our foreign minister. Our foreign minister should send a message strongly to the African Union. If this is how we are going to be talking and we are still going to be swimming at the surf of the ocean, we are not helping the continent. And let me also conclude that we can't also be talking about too many things at the same time. No, it can't be. We should have a defined line of action. 10 years from now, what is Africa seeking to achieve? Everybody is talking about trade. Everybody is talking about transport. Everybody is talking about movement. Yes, they are all important. But can we, as a continent, classify and say that the next 10 years, this is the priority? By 10 years from now, Africa should have been able to achieve this, and then we move ahead. We can mix everything up and say that we want to develop. That will be a problem. But the matter on reparation should not be a subject matter of consideration at all. The Honorable Agaga, who spoke in context about what the Honorable Kojo Oppong-Nkrumah said, I equally agree with him. Yes. If you look at the role that people like Mensa Saba and co-icons of Africa did when colonial masters had wanted to take over our lands are things that we have to be proud of. So a number of our icons have also stood toe to toe to our Europeans. It is entirely not true that Africans largely contributed in the Atlantic slave trade and sold and facilitated the sale of our people to the Europeans. No, there were people, as history has recorded, who stood tall. You can name the Sagranti War and all the likes, and all the people who stood tall to defend Africans and to defend our forefathers. When we are recounting the history, we must recount the history properly. So, Speaker, it's a day we have to celebrate, be out of context, and at this stage and at this time in our life, we can't continuously be talking about reparation. Speaker, let me conclude on this $100 million call that Africans have always been looking at the European world, the developed world, that in the context of the fact that these developed countries pollute more, they should send Africans some $100 billion. This has remained a mirage. It's not happening. Year in, year out, at the COP, Conference of Parties, we make that strong advocacy. It only falls on deaf ears, and we come home and we come and lament. It cannot be a litany of lamentation without results. Let's go out there, take our destiny in our hands, demand for fair trade. This is something we call Eurogap standard, which is limiting Africans from penetrating the European world. These are the calls we should make, and I think if we are able to do this out of patriotism, we'll be able to make a difference. 10 years from now, let's come and tick the boxes. Which were the ones that we were able to achieve, which were the ones that are outstanding, and then we can make a meaningful progress towards the true emancipation of the continent. Speaker, thank you for recognizing me.
Thank you, Majority Leadership. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I also want to wish the African leaders well in the 38th ordinary session that is just about to happen. Mr. Speaker, the issue of reparation is one that divides opinions, but I am of a strong view that it is not a subject that we Africans or black people should just sweep under the carpet. Yes, there are so many things that we have to do for ourselves. We have said that we do only about 3% of trade among ourselves, that is intra-trade in Africa. And we need to do more. We need to do business with ourselves more than we do with others elsewhere. There are a lot of things. We are sitting on, minerals that are still being exploited from us, and there are so many things that we have to do. But that does not mean that we should forget about the subject of, reparation. Mr. Speaker, injustice has not got a lifespan. It's like justice. And when we talk about reparation, we are always talking about money. Reparation is not only about money. There are other forms of assistance that we can get for what they have done to us. That does not necessarily mean that they have to hand over money to us. My honorable leader was talking about getting an equal trade. How do you get an equal trade? You can use reparation to get that equal trade. You've got to establish that wrong things were done and that somebody needs to compensate the other for. And then we can sit down and look at exactly the form of compensation that we need. Should that be a reduction of tariffs? Should it be other things that we take into the European Union or to the Americas that need to be looked at? We had an agreement with the Americans, the AGOA agreement, which was signed 20 years ago. And we have signed it again, I think, on 2 occasions. And I think the last one is about to expire. But we have not taken advantage of it. These are some of the things we should be looking at. Even if we get a reparation, what sort of advantage as Africans are we going to take to make sure that that benefits us? But we should not just have in our minds that anytime we talk about reparation, we are asking for somebody to bring us money. We can do that in negotiating many different agreements, preferably in the area of trade, to make sure that Africa actually gets benefit. We talk about Africans participating. Cape Coast. When you come, you will see castles and all that, where these trades actually took place. And yes, you can establish that Africans took part. But as Honorable Agaga said, they were induced to take part. The fight, history will tell you that wars in Africa went up as a result of slave trade, because it became a lucrative business to actually go and fight your neighbor and capture them and sell them to somebody else to take them to the Americas to make money. We were just used as middle people to help the Europeans to do this slave trade or to cause this harm to us. Who benefited from it? Which billionaires do you know that make so much money from slave trade in Africa? But Europe and Americas are littered with old money that trace their sources to the slave trade. And somebody needs to compensate the other for wrongdoing. Mr. Speaker, you realize that a lot of artwork that were stolen from Africa are actually coming back. Quite recently, we got some for the Ashantis. How did we get that? Because we made a case that those arts should be returned to Africa because it belongs to us and they were stolen. If we hadn't made a case, those artwork would still be sitting in Europe. So we should not just sit back, lay back, and said we were a victim of our own, whatever happened to us. No, something went wrong that has not been addressed, and it is still a fundamental thing for we black people, wherever we may find ourselves, whether in Europe, in America, or even here in Africa. And something needs to happen. But let's get into our minds that when we talk about reparation, we are not only talking about payment of money by one person to the other. It can be done in so many other ways that will be beneficial. We are borrowing money at astronomical rate from the Western world. We have appetite for borrowing money. And some of these rates that we are being charged are not actually reasonable, but we don't seem to have a choice. These are some of the areas we can actually negotiate so that some of these rates of borrowing, if we have to, are actually reduced as part of the reparation payment, but not necessarily sitting down for somebody to dole us cash. Mr. Speaker, thank you very much for my contribution, and I thank the maker of the statement for a good job done. Thank you.
That brings us to the end of this statement. Honorable members, I have another statement in the name of Honorable Dr. Stephen Amwa, dealing with certain fundamentals, economic anomalies in Ghana. Honorable, you have the floor. Order.
Sorry. Right, Honorable Speaker, I am extremely thankful to you and your noble outfit for according me this prestigious opportunity to make this important statement in this august house. Mr. Speaker, I am making this statement on certain fundamental financial economic anomalies in Ghana, which need to be rectified. One of such policies is the management of our monetary policy with respect to the periodical adjustments of Ghana's policy rate. monetary policy is simply about decisions made by central banks, such as the Bank of Ghana, makes on the money supply and interest rates. Normally, policy rates are determined to optimize the amount of money in circulation. The strategic technique of adopting inflationary targeted monetary policy in Ghana has not really yielded the expected results. It has rather been a strategic drift. The strategic technique of adopting inflationary targeted monetary policy in Ghana has not really yielded the expected results. It has rather been very dysfunctional and has not helped us as a country. Mr. Speaker, policy rate increased from 12.92% in 2011 to 25% in 2016, with their respective inflationary rates increasing from 8.73% to 17.51%. Policy rate decreased from 22.5% in 2017 to 16.00% in 2019, with their corresponding inflationary rate of 12.39% to 7.17%. GDP growth, Mr. Speaker, reduced from 13.90 to 3.4 in the same period. Between 2021 and 2023, GDP reduced from 5.10% to 2.90%. Mr. Speaker, policy rates in 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2023 were 14.75%, 14%, 20.21%, and 29.50%. And inflationary rates were 9.94%, 9.96%, 31.949%, and 40.28% respectively. Inflationary targeted monetary policy, that is the policy rate, is increased to reduce inflation so that the economy can be stabilized. The above trend, Mr. Speaker, illustrates the opposite. Increases in the policy rate rather increases inflation. It means that it is not just the magnitude of the inflation that determines how the monetary policy should be adjusted, but rather the cause of it. Mr. Speaker, this policy anomaly must be checked by the relevant stakeholders to stop its dysfunctional contribution to our unstable economic performance. It erodes the purchasing power of Ghanaians. It increases the cost of doing business and lowers standard of living. It is only when inflation increases as a result of demand pull, that is when people are buying and selling, and there is a high circulation of money on the market, that one can adjust the policy rate upwards, and vice versa. Typically, Ghana's inflation is induced by cost push, that is from the supplier's end. Interest rate has been a very strong element in the aggregate cost of doing business, as most investors in Ghana rely on debt financing, I mean loans. Cost push inflation does not profoundly induce economic growth. In the trends analyzed above, the corresponding GDP growths were not rather following the expected trends. Mr. Speaker, my maiden statement during the 8th Parliament also unraveled another important anomaly. That was the pricing of treasury bills, that is government securities or risk-free as categorized in investment or risk-return principles, and the comparable risky assets on the market. It is making Ghana's market or economy deviate from the global standard. In fact, all the traditional models for computing the returns from investing in risky assets are not effectively applicable in Ghana. It defeats the fundamental principles of risk-return policy in investment. Examples are the capital asset pricing model, that is CAPM, and the arbitrage pricing theorem, APT. It is introducing the element of arbitrariness in the decision-making processes of capital asset pricing in Ghana. Some schools of thought have it that it is as a result of government high demand for funds. We are dealing with a dysfunctional policy decision and its adverse impact on our economy. All these comments are welcome as they may assist in dealing with the inimical policy. It is indeed, Mr. Speaker, dysfunctional to the performance of the Republic of Ghana. It calls for a policy shift as well as regulatory reforms by the relevant stakeholders. Mr. Speaker, being hungry does not necessitate intake of pathogenic materials or toxins or even poisons. These anomalies contribute not only to the high cost of doing business, but also high exchange rates, low productivity, high unemployment, and banks' risk exposure. Ghanaian companies cannot produce to meet aggregate demand and accordingly resort to importation. Ghana's economy can be accordingly described as double-digit interest rate economy, and it is basically, among other factors, caused by these financial economic anomalies. There are other policies that we need to critically look at. For instance, absolute free market economy, a country in which we have a weak entrepreneurial ecosystem and profiteering culture. We should begin a conversation whether we need a mixed market economy to provide specific price caps, Mr. Speaker, for monopoly, oligopoly, or even cartels. For controlled market economy, Mr. Speaker, I will not advise for a capitalistic economy to be exercised. However, I would like to propose that a committee is set up by the Finance Committee, Economy and Development Committee, and Budget Committee to engage the Bank of Ghana and possibly the Finance Ministry on these important policies. We need to remedy these fundamental anomalies to enable us build a resilient economy for the purposes of attaining the needed long-term economic growth and stability. Without that, our quest for economic independence, national import substitution, strong and stable currency, and high employment rate will never be realized. Mr. Speaker, I would like to end with a plea. Please, I pray that some of these critical issues will be accorded the needed attention and action. I thank you, Mr. Speaker, once again, but in anticipation. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Honorable Dr. Stephen. I start a contribution from Honorable Azika Dongo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to commend the maker of the statement who has consistently contributed to improving the economic management principles of our country, particularly monetary policy and capital asset pricing. I recall he made a statement earlier where he questioned the basis for banks that were taking cheaper deposits, basically giving loans at a higher rate than government, which is seen as a risk-free investor, which obviously didn't make sense, given that the banks carry risk that government doesn't. But his own government ended up proving him wrong when the government became more riskier than the banks and began to do DDEP and restructuring its debts, which had basically defeated the common known principle that when you give more loans to government, they are risk-free. So we still are learning, and over time, I'm sure we'll find the solutions to some of them. But I agree in most parts now to the community as to direction that we want inflation to go. And we do know that when people expect inflation to be tamed, chances are that inflation will follow suit. But in our absence of adjusting the policy rate, chances are that people will begin to see inflation not being targeted. And as a result, the expectation will be that inflation will continue to grow. And our inflation targeting framework is premised on a combination of inflation targeting and managing inflation expectation. And at the moment, we have not found a better way of doing it. I do agree that monetary policy may not be adequate in dealing with the myriad of problems that are confronted our country, particularly when we know that even though hardcore inflation or headline inflation may be seen to be trending downwards when you increase the policy rate, but if you look at the core measures of inflation, you would find that not all of it can be addressed by policy rate. So for instance, food inflation, how do you use, policy rate as a major tool for addressing what is essentially a misallocation of resources from the fiscal side? So when a government is not putting the money into agriculture, when the government is not putting the money to grow industries so that we can produce other to substitute for domestic consumption or to reduce the cost of production of food, no amount of policy rate would be able to tackle that. So I agree that there must be complementary fiscal action that makes sure that in the medium term, we are able to address a key part of our inflation, which is the food inflation. Of course, there are other factors that are necessarily not food inflation, like energy, like fuel. We will need to find a way to address that. But, Mr. Speaker, we do have a problem, is that monetary policy itself tends to forget that its actions in terms of using policy rate has an impact on the general ability of the economy to grow food and to produce for us. Because, like he said, the cost of borrowing itself is being exacerbated by policy rate increases. Today, we don't do base rate, but we do what we call the Bank of Ghana reference rate. And the Bank of Ghana reference rate is calculated as a weighted average between the policy rate and the treasury bill rate. So if rates go up or policy rate go up, automatically the reference rate that define the base at which businessmen and individuals must borrow will automatically go up. And if you borrow at a higher rate, it is obvious that your cost of production will go up and the cost of producing food will be high and the cost of producing industrial products will be high. So we need to find a way to deal with this transmission from policy rate to the base rate or the reference rate at which businesses and individuals have to borrow. If we are not able to tackle this, then any time we are attempting to solve the problem of inflation, we are also dealing with the base of the problem itself, which is production, because the cost of production would go up. And once the cost of production goes up, you expect the businessmen to want to recoup all that cost in addition to margins that are placed on the product that are produced. And so in that case, you will see policy rate become dysfunctional, as my colleague calls it. Those of us who attended Zamsys we don't call it dysfunctional. As you mentioned, we call it dysfunctional. But the Achibota people, they are here. Listen to that man. So it confirms exactly the fear that he has, that policy rate has a tendency to limit the proper production of goods and services, and therefore leading to additional round of inflation and others. But we do also know that the monetary policy is not only targeting inflation, but general price development. So interest rate, exchange rate, and inflation. Now, each of them depend on the other. Once you are not able to deal with exchange rate, and you begin to get higher exchange rate volatility, it will feed into the price of goods and services and inflation. Now, in an attempt to address this problem, you then go to touch interest rate, and then you come back in a spiral because that policy rate that you are tackling to use to tackle inflation will then lead to a higher cost of production. So we need to find a model that really understands the dynamics and the structure of our economy. He brings in a very interesting conversation as to what type of economy we should run, whether we should run a market economy or we should find a hybrid. I don't think that we have the answers. This will require a lot of conversation and analysis on our economy. But generally, I do believe that the model that we have set ourselves up itself leads to inefficient utilization and allocation of resources, and we begin to find ourselves in just cycles of the same problem. So a government of the day finds relief, we begin to trumpet an achievement, and just one event, we are back to square one, and then we are criticizing each other once again, and we need to find a way to get out of that. So I want to thank the maker of the statement, and to thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to comment on the statement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable Azikadongo. Honorable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity. I'd like to also commend the maker of the statement and also accede to the fact that our policy rates tend to have a positive relationship with our inflation, and as the statistics and the data that he acceded to, and also determine and also let us know that we have almost all the time targeted the opposite. We have almost all the time targeted an inverse relationship, but we don't get that. Mr. Speaker, as we speak, Ghana's policy rate is around 27%, and the corresponding interest rates is between 29.7 and 35%, depending on the bank that you are dealing with and your risk factor that the bank will determine for you. A 2-year average, as we speak now, has been around 29.9%, and a 5-year interest rate average is around 22.3%. Mr. Speaker, we need to understand as a country what really constitutes or what really accounts for our inflation. And as they have already said, whether it is cost push or is demand. Is it the demand that is causing our inflation, or is it the cost that is causing our inflation? And we need to understand these dynamics. Otherwise, whatever policy rate that we decide to bring might not yield the results that we have intended to have. Mr. Speaker, one thing that we need to understand is businesses, when they are finding capital for their businesses, might be from a number of sources, from equity or from debt or from a combination of both or from other sources. We need to understand that in Ghana, most businesses and most entrepreneurs do their financing or their capital mostly from debt. And this is causing a lot of issues for us. If, for example, as the Honorable Adongo said, if the policy rate is, or the interest rate is a combination between the policy rate and also other factors, then it means that, as we have said, if the policy rate goes up...
Honourable members, the Speaker should take the chair.
That means that if the policy rate goes up,
Yes, Honourable Member, you may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, as we said, it means that if the policy rate goes up, then automatically we are also looking at a higher interest rate. Now, I'm just wondering how, when the interest rate goes up, my investor or the entrepreneur in Kwabri East who produces sachet water, Ahenanai sachet water, will be able to borrow at that one and be able to get enough margins on the interest to be able to get enough profit to turn his business around. And the next factor that you have to do is to turn your business around. And Mr. Speaker, the business environment in Ghana does not really support turning businesses around quicker, because the average cycle for a business is around 30 to 45 days, and people don't usually buy on cash. So how will a businessman borrow at a higher cost and turn his business around to be able to produce more? And this is really quite a tough ask and a tough challenge for us and for businessmen and business people in Ghana. So it is not sustainable. This high cost of borrowing is not sustainable. And if, per the analysis and the statistics that we are seeing, if there's a high possibility that this is being caused by a higher policy rate, then we need to come back to the table and have a thorough discussion of these things. Otherwise, we risk putting our businesses and our businessmen out of business. Mr. Speaker, to put this into context, UK and US. In UK now has a policy rate of around 4.75%. Mr. Speaker, since 1972, the highest policy rate that has gone is around in UK is 20.1%. And since 1972, the average has been around 5.79%. And you see that it also corresponds with their inflation rate. US also has a similar policy rate. Mr. Speaker, how can we compete with these foreign markets if they have a lower policy rate leading to a corresponding lower interest rate, which is also cushioning their businesses and making their prices lower as compared to us in Ghana? It is very important that we look at this factor and also make sure that our place, or Ghana, is not a dumping site. Look at the businesses or look at the products that come from China. They are very cheap, less costly, and they are competing with our local manufacturers, and they are taking our businesses out of the market. So, Mr. Speaker, the maker of this statement has made a very profound statement, and because this has become a very thought-provoking statement, we need to address it, and we need to come back to the table and find out, as I said, what is really causing inflation, and so that we know which policy or which instrument we will use to target inflation. And whatever the case is, this is thought-provoking. It needs constant jaw-jawing around the table, and I think that it is right about time that we do that in order to save our businesses in Ghana. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I once again would like to commend the maker of the statement.
Yes, Honorable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to have a bite on my colleague, Honorable Stephen Amoah's input on this. Mr. Speaker, his issue is on, he made a statement on certain fundamental financial economic abnormalities in Ghana, which need to be rectified, on which his emphasis is on the issue of policy rates that keep on coming up, government upon government, and yet we are not finding our feet as far as the economic is concerned. Mr. Speaker, we don't need to go far in analyzing policy rate issues when we know that our economy is more demand-driven, which outpaces the issue of supply. Mr. Speaker, inflation basically is the continuous rising in the prices of goods and services with a corresponding increase in production. And so when demand outweighs supply, the issue of demand pool inflation arises, because the total demand, or what we call aggregate demand, tend to outweigh aggregate supply. When we lump all the demands in the system together, from the individual to the whole economy, as against the total supply from suppliers, from individual supply to the aggregate supply, and the demand outweighs, then definitely demand pulls inflation tend to come in. And no amount of policy rate by any government or Bank of Ghana governor can outweigh this thing. The fundamental issue is, how do we produce more in excess? When we have excess supply, we feed individual homes. We are able to feed our industries with the excess. The industries overproduce. When we export, then the issue of dollar automatically comes down. We don't need a magician. We don't need mathematical analysis. Anything we are doing in the nation is about less supply, less production. Mr. Speaker, may I take you back? When President Obama visited Ghana, it was simple. What he told us was that we should let our systems work. If we overproduce at the rural areas, is it irrigation that we can't have? Mr. Speaker, we have a lot of river bodies across Ghana. Water flowing into the sea 24/7 freely. Can we go into irrigation along the river bodies, distance kilometers away from rivers, so that we have enough production of whatever food we need? Can we take to excess production to feed our poultry industries, to reduce the bringing in of, excuse me to say, carcasses from other countries? The rice fields are in abundance. Mr. Speaker, Kintampo North alone, the rice field we have can feed the country. Can we go into the Volta region? I know the rice that they produce. Northeast, the Mankrago, Yarba Kubaru areas. My former sports minister, his place, when most of the MPs, your MPs, Mr. Speaker, we are farmers there. If we concentrate, but here is the case, Mr. Speaker, those who produced rice last year in abundance, they didn't have market. Rice production was in abundance in this nation last year. They didn't have market. Tamale, Mankrabo, Yarba Kubaru, Volta region, no market for us. We are undoing our own economy. No amount of what is it called, explanation should we continue to have. The maker of the statement, he was the deputy finance minister when rice was not bought in this country from local consumers. Mr. Speaker, I would like my brother to get back to that economy, the basis of economics in Ghana. Production should outweigh supply. Production should outweigh demand so that we get our figures right. If not, no magician, no Bank of Ghana magician can have anything of that sort done in this country. I thank you for the analysis anyway. We'll continue to analyze economics if we don't go to practical economics. If we don't practicalize it on the field, producing more tractors like the 24-hour economy, His Excellency John Dramani Mahama wants to bring down to do. We need to supply more tractors to the farmers. Let them have tractors at the right time to farm the granules, farm the rice, farm the yams, farm the soya beans. When we overproduce and the excess we export, we will not be analyzing any Bank of Ghana rate. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Minority Chief Whip.
Speaker, with greatest respect, I try to catch your attention. I was enjoying my good friend until he decided to go on a frolic of his own. And Speaker, I wanted to draw his attention to Order 93.5, that this is a subject matter which has been raised by our colleague. And the approach should be more of a sense of patriotism, and he shouldn't try to raise any debate. Unfortunately, Speaker, I didn't catch your eye. And this has gone into the Hansard. This has gone to the Hansard. Speaker, I'm grateful.
Sorry, what has gone into the Hansard?
Speaker, I thought that he was talking about production. He was looking at market sources and all that. Then he directed attention at the maker of the statement that he was the Deputy Minister of Finance. But of course, the role of the Deputy Minister of Finance is defined. It's not about markets. It's not provision of market. I thought he was raising debate, but Speaker, I can leave this matter for another day.
Yes, once you were mentioned, you have a right of rebuttal.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. I think I have to bring this clarity out. The statement I made, it is not the responsibility of the Finance Ministry to make that amendment. It's rather a monetary policy which falls within the functional jurisdiction of Bank of Ghana. So I want to correct my brother. It's got nothing to do with market price of rice. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, just for that clarity. Thank you for the opportunity.
I thought you spoke. Not you.
No, Mr. Speaker.
Okay. Since you are a step ahead of your colleagues, I think you have a chance.
All right. Thank you, Right Honorable Speaker, for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. Mr. Speaker, I would like to comment briefly on the statement made by the Honorable Member for Ishayesu. Mr. Speaker, it is true that at times certain policy expectations of policymakers do not happen as expected. And the case in question, as raised by the maker of the statement, is the Monetary Policy Committee's rate. Mr. Speaker, the intentions of the policy rate mostly is to determine or give direction as to where inflation should be, i.e., if inflation is high, the plan is to raise monetary policy rates so that there will be more appetite, or appetite of investors will go up, and liquidity will be mobbed to invest in securities. But then normally you do not get this expectation. And Mr. Speaker, we should not forget that our market is not efficient, our market is not matured, and our market is dynamic. One side, which, Mr. Speaker, we need to look at, is the fact that our country, Ghana, is still largely import dependent. And as the Monetary Policy Committee is doing its best to mop up liquidity in order to control inflation, you will have strong demand for hard currencies. People are putting their monies in dollars, in euro, and other hard currencies, and in so doing, weakening our cedi. So it goes round, comes back to hit us, as we are weakening our local currency by investing in other currencies. So, Mr. Speaker, one way to addressing this issue of anomaly is to look inward into how we push to depend on our own produce, to depend on the things that we need locally. And one of them that was championed and has been championed well, which I recommend we continue, is the 1D, 1F, which was put across by ex-President Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo. This program alone could change the scene and let these policy measures get their desired results. Mr. Speaker, another point that was put across by my honorable member or honorable friend is the issue of government securities normally having higher yields than those issued by private entities. And Mr. Speaker, this is not the expectation of many, because as it is said, government securities, you expect them to be risk-free. But Mr. Speaker, we know around the world it is not always the case. We've had some corporate institutions that have never reneged on their obligations, whereas the opposite is what we've seen in other jurisdictions. So yes, the theory is strong, and I do align with my honorable friend. However, these anomalies do happen because of these challenges of some sovereigns not meeting their obligations, whereas some corporate bodies meeting their obligations, having better ratings, and of course, having their yields being lower as expected. So, Mr. Speaker, not to repeat what my other colleagues have put across, I support the honorable member's submission, and what I'll add is we need to do more. We need to domesticate more, produce more locally to support our currency, to avoid this put-through from foreign currencies that we invest so much in, and in other ways, bringing inflation through the back door to our economy. Mr. Speaker, I thank you very much.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Right Honourable Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to make brief contributions towards dealing with the certain fundamental economic anomalies in Ghana. The statement ably made by our colleague, Dr. Stephen Amoah, I tend to agree with the statement that he's made, Mr. Speaker, because if you look at the economic history of Ghana, I don't think that there has been any success or any time that we have recorded success in using monetary policy to deal with inflation. It's always been the opposite. And I tend to agree largely with my colleagues that have argued that there is a need for us to increase production. In fact, economics beyond the textbooks and beyond all the really big jargons is very simple things. We are having the issues of scarcity. We need to prioritize our expenditure, look at what are when we scale our national priority or in this chamber. Indeed, if you are importing more than you are producing, definitely there's going to have a problem with inflation. If we talk about import substitution, what are we talking about? We're simply talking about you generating sufficient local industries, businesses that are producing things that you are importing. Once you can do that, you reduce the pressure on the foreign currency. Then it's easier for you to deal with inflation. And that's why I agree perfectly with the maker of the statement. Mr. Speaker, particularly when you look at the third paragraph of the statement on the first page, the maker pointed some statistics out. Mr. Speaker, with your permission, this was, Mr. Speaker, policy rates increased from 12.92% in 2011 to 25% in 2016, with their respective inflationary rates increasing from 8.73% to 17.51%. Mr. Speaker, so it means that irrespective of how grandiose your policy rate or the monetary policy committee of the Bank of Ghana brings these policies as a way of targeting inflation, it has never achieved its goal. And indeed, when you look at from the same statistics that he gave us from 2021 all the way to 2023, 2021, 2022, 2023, the relationship is the same. So let's accept the fact that monetary policies have not achieved the ultimate goal of dealing with inflation, and that we must go back to the roots, which is production, production, production. Invest more into industries, create the local economy, make sure that the rice that we are importing, reduce the rice importation. Let's reduce the chicken importation, and let's invest through the 24-hour economy and make sure that we produce more chicken, we produce more rice, we produce, more agro products that would substitute for these things that we always import. That way, Mr. Speaker, I believe that this anomaly in our economy will definitely be addressed. Thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute to this statement, Mr. Speaker.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I also want to join my colleagues to thank the maker of this statement for bringing to fore this important issue of how monetary policy is not performing the expected role of driving down inflation within the broader perspective or within the broader policy of inflation anchoring or inflation targeting. Mr. Speaker, Ghana has an inflation target within the IMF program of 8% plus minus 2%. In other words, we are expected to do at 8% inflation rate. And one of the tools the central bank uses to achieve this is the issue of policy rate. And the policy rate is expected to achieve its objective only when the physical angle of monetary, of the whole economic mechanism is put into play. If there is no coherence, if there is inconsistency, if there is no hegemony between the fiscal policy and then the monetary policy, you don't expect the monetary policy to achieve its objective. And Mr. Speaker, if, for instance, the objective of monetary policy is to mob up excess liquidity in the system, and in this regard, the dominant borrower in the economy is the government, the central government. Irrespective of how much we hike interest rate, the central bank will have to still go and borrow in order to finance salaries and wages and compensation, in order to finance debt servicing. So because there is this continuous cycle of government having to borrow in order to satisfy certain key expenditure handles, irrespective of the rate, the central bank will hike the interest rate. You still find government coming in to borrow. So until we are able to address that, and Mr. Speaker, we can address that by gravitating towards a system where we can have a relatively optimal revenue to GDP level in line with other best practices. When we have revenue coming up to match expenditure, would be able to do with this particular anemic fiscal policy we have been experiencing. Mr. Speaker, we will also need to know that inflation is a stubborn cat, Mr. Speaker. Inflation is a stubborn cat, and it does not listen to the language of the fiscal policy, of the monetary policy makers. It will only take, and I agree totally with the other contributors, that it will take the fiscal policy, i.e. the real sector, the production of goods and services, and try learning in economics that says law, tells us that supply creates its own demand. In other words, when we put much effort into the production, we'll be able to drive down prices of goods and services to contain the rate of inflation. Mr. Speaker, the stability of our currency also determines inflation. This is the component we refer to as imported inflation. Imported inflation in the sense that we can do all the things right. We can increase the policy rate. Money in circulation could be reduced. Demand push inflation would probably be tamed. But if the basket of goods and services we consume in this country is imported, foreign exchange losses alone is going to increase prices of goods and services. So, Mr. Speaker, we'll have to do something about our stability of our currency in order to address this anomaly as highlighted by our colleague. Mr. Speaker, the anomaly is present, but we need to also ask, why is the USA Federal Reserve having a negative correlation between the Federal Reserve rate and also inflation? Because whenever inflation is galloping and the USA Federal Reserve hikes the policy rate, you will find a corresponding decline in the prices of goods and services. But in our case, as presented by the maker and the data thereof, we don't see that. Probably we need to ask this relevant question, and some of the answers have been proffered. Mr. Speaker, all across board, quantitative easing and quantitative tightening have been measures classical economists or classical macroeconomic theories use These important tools are important for the management of economy. Economic management will have to be done with the combination of these tools. Quantitative easing, which is, in other words, reducing the policy rate, and quantitative tightening, in other words, hiking the policy rate. We have been using this, but it has not generated the effective returns in terms of the relevant economic indicators. We will have to look at how do we manage this tool appropriately to address the issue of inflation. Mr. Speaker, we are not working in introspection. I will conclude, Mr. Speaker, by saying that whereas we lament that policy rate is not giving the required returns, i.e. reduction in inflation, we must also ask the question, but for the policy rate, what would have happened to the economy? This is where I think that the call by the engagement between the central bank and the relevant committees of parliament will come handy, because the counterfactual is not known. If the central bank does not hike the policy rate, we will not know what would have happened but for the hike in the policy rate. This will take genuine, intensive, and collaborative effort between the central bank, the government, and parliament, which has oversight, to bring to force. So I will support the proposal and the call to Mr. Speaker that we should have an engagement between the Economic and Development Committee or the Finance Committee with the central bank to look at this whole issue of why this policy failure over 2 decades, over 6 decades of implementation, following the free market economy system we have subscribed to. Mr. Speaker, I thank the makers for this great statement, and I will urge again, I also join in the multitude in urging you to actually take this matter seriously, because the success of Mr. John Dramani government is going to be determined by the exchange rate, going to be determined by foreign exchange rate, going to be determined by how down or low interest rates are. And if the monetary policy is failing them, and the fiscal policy is not also doing well, we will come back to this hall and lament about how the government was not able to achieve some of the major grandiose promises they made to the good people of Ghana. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, Deputy Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I will thank the maker of the statement for what I think is an extremely important statement that begins to open up a serious debate on this relationship between policy rate and inflation. Mr. Speaker, I think one of the fundamental problems that we have faced in this country in making our policy rate work. I've already started. You want me to stop? Minister can come in early. Okay. So, Mr. Speaker, so fundamentally, let me finish. Just please. Finish. Mr. Speaker, we have failed fundamentally because we have not been able to understand the type of inflation, and I mean the managers of the economy have not really understood the kind of inflation that we've been dealing with, especially in the last 5 years. Mr. Speaker, inflation comes by many ways, and the old textbook methodology of dealing with inflation has changed in the modern days of modern economics. Mr. Speaker, inflation traditionally or originally used to be a demand-driven, and that is why this arrangement between interest rate and inflation or policy rate were actually put in place, because you can then use your money supply, which is basically what interest rate is, to take money out of the system or put it in, depending on the heat that your economy is generating as a result of inflation. But when you have inflation,
coming from different places other than the traditional demand inflation, which is what happens to us during the COVID period, when we have supply chain disruptions, where our inflation was coming from supply side, demand side, and also the exchange rate, then it is difficult to use monetary policy to address that problem. What the central bank did in 2020, which in my opinion was a mistake, was to try and resolve inflation by trying to deal with both the demand side and the supply side, and not allowing the Ministry of Finance, who is responsible for the supply side, because the supply side was physical, actually left the space for the central bank to do that. And central bank ended up pumping money to address a problem that had nothing to do with them. It was a bad prescription given to a sickness they had no idea what the sickness. And that is what caused us the problem that we in. Historically, we've had a problem with interest rate or policy rate not exactly being proportional as the traditional arrangement in textbook, that normally your interest rate is proportional to your inflation. Therefore, whichever direction your inflation is moving, that is where your interest rate will also move to be able to address it. But when you have a situation where your inflation is really becoming exponential, but your policy rate is not dealing with it, then the problem is more than demand side. We had a serious challenge side problem. My brother mentioned, Doc mentioned about the United States system. When you have the Treasury addressing inflation, they do their bit. You can still see inflation going up, no matter what the Treasury is doing, or no matter what the Federal Reserve is doing. It's because that the Fed are doing their bit, and the Treasury should also do their bit. In the last 5 years in Ghana, the central bank got it completely wrong in doing monetary policy and fiscal policy all in monetary policy, and they got it absolutely wrong. And that is why we ended up with so much money being spent by the central bank. Normally, how will central bank end up in debt? It's unimaginable that your central bank, which is the bank of last resort, actually is losing money and has no one to bail it out, because they were using money to solve a problem that should have been done by the fiscal side. And that is what we got into a mess. And that conversation is a serious one that we need to begin to look at. Exactly, is inflation targeting still a thing to do? And in my opinion, no. Because you cannot target inflation with monetary policy any longer. You will have to look at where the inflation is actually coming from, and use all the tools available to you, the monetary policy, the fiscal policy. How do you deal with inflation when it's coming from your exchange rate? Because exchange rate has inflation. If your currency is depreciating, it means that the component of inflation in your exchange rate will also be going up, and that will feed. And if you are using monetary policy to try and address those problems, we are always going to get it wrong. So it's about time we need to sit down and rethink. Our central bank need to rethink about how they use monetary policy to try and address inflation. And I must commend the maker of the statement for bringing something that I believe in the next few years will basically begin to change economics the way we think about it here in Ghana, because it has moved from the old economics to a modern day economics, which the managers of the economy don't seem to have grasped the fundamentals of it. Mr. Speaker, with these few words, I will end here. Thank you.
Speaker, the direction I was getting from the deputy leader was that he was coming to leadership. But if it is your pleasure that you will still allow members to speak, Speaker, I will leave that to you. Because I was about
What's
reminding him
the
that
pleasure of the House?
The pleasure of the House is that I will yield my space to the former finance minister to speak. But I was reminding you, leader, that don't take your majority for granted. You are in the majority. And the practice has been that when some of these things, you speak last. So I was signaling you that we will speak, and then you speak last, but you were not listening. You are in the majority. Don't take it for granted. Speaker, may I seek your leave for the former Minister of Finance to speak instead?
Okay.
With your leave.
No problem.
Thank you, Right Honorable Speaker. Right Honorable Speaker, the statement in respect of inflation targeting is a very important statement because inflation targeting has become debatable throughout the world as a vehicle for containing inflation. Other countries have other models. For example, we used to have the currency peg, which was a system by which a country pegged its currency to the currency of a low inflation country. But the problem with that was the problems in your country or solutions in your country are tied to the country whose currency you pegged yours against. And so many countries run away from the currency peg model. Others will tie it to growth. But we decided to do inflation targeting. And by inflation targeting, it is defining an inflation path and using interest rates to drive inflation towards that path, to the desired inflation target. It is not only Ghana that is using it. Many other countries, including some of the advanced countries, are using inflation targeting. And it has worked for us so far. It has worked well. There have been problems, but it has worked well for us so far, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is not to say that there are no problems associated with inflation targeting. For example, Mr. Speaker, its focus on inflation is at the expense of other economic variables, such as growth and employment. And if you want to use rates to drive down inflation, you may face some rigidities, what we call structural rigidities. When rates are higher, they do not incentivize production because the private sector, that makes production is crowded out. And when rates are lower, intended to drive inflation down, it also does not incentivize production because of the structural rigidities in our economy. So because of our structural rigidities, our economy doesn't really respond to policy change. And that is the problem you find with inflation targeting, whether it is bringing about rate increases or rate decreases. The other issue with inflation targeting is its limited flexibility in response to shocks. We have experienced a number of shocks, and these are associated with the deputy majority leader, whether it is supply chain shocks or it is financial crisis. Inflation targeting has limited capacity to respond to those shocks because of its focus on inflation. And this is why central banks will normally respond. And so this is where I disagree with him. Central banks will respond when inflation targeting is not achieving its desired objective because of the shocks associated with the economy. And these shocks are mostly shocks that are external to the economy. And so if our central bank responded by putting more money into the market, I don't see anything wrong with that. And so our central bank acted responsibly. Also because the budget is so tight. And where the budget is tight and you're facing a crisis, there is no reason why the central bank should not respond. Whether they responded in excess of what they should have done or not is something we can discuss. But as far as the response by the central bank is concerned, they acted responsibly as a central bank. And so, Mr. Speaker, I don't see any problem with that. Mr. Speaker, this is where exchange rate affects our inflation. When we had crisis globally, the Russia-Ukraine war, which caused logistical constraint globally and inflation rose, significantly across the world, to the extent that median inflation in the advanced countries went to about 7.5%. And so when advanced countries are recording 7.5% median inflation, countries that normally will record 1% or less than 1%, recording 7.5 median inflation, then I wonder why anybody will have problems with the levels of inflation Ghana recorded during that crisis. Because through the exchange rate, we suffered in our inflation increasing. The reason also was that because of inflation increasing globally, the advanced countries, their central banks did that. They raised rates. And by raising rates, their financial instruments became more attractive. And so investing in Ghana and other open economies withdrew their investment to go and take advantage of the profits in the advanced countries. And that led to our exchange rate suffering. The cedi suffered as a result of that because of scarcity of foreign exchange, as a result of the withdrawal from our market. And so in that case, which body has responsibility for exchange rate management? Again, it is the Bank of Ghana. It is the central bank. And so the response by the central bank, in my view, it was very responsible, and we should commend them for coming to the support of our government and our country to ensure that the effect was not as pronounced as it would have been, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what we need to do, if inflation targeting has to play its role, is for us to promote policy coordination between the central bank and the Ministry of Finance. Monetary policy and fiscal policy coordination is so critical for us. I don't see that coordination. The central bank is independent. The government does not dictate to the central bank. Yet, the policies of the central bank, if they are not coordinated with the policies of the Ministry of Finance or of the government, the economy suffers eventually. And players in the economy, consumers, suppliers, they all will suffer as a result. Mr. Speaker, let me give an example. There have been times the Ministry of Finance went to the market for T-bills, and we got uncovered options. We got shortfalls. But at the same time, the Bank of Ghana, through the Bank of Ghana bills, they are getting oversubscribed. And so Bank of Ghana will go to the market because they want to take out excess liquidity. Yet the Ministry of Finance, that wants money to finance the budget, goes to the market, and we encounter uncovered options. So why would the two bodies be on the market looking for the same money which we need to finance our budget? And so because of the lack of coordination, monetary policy, fiscal policy coordination, the budget suffers, and yet inflation is not being addressed. And so what we call second round effects becomes the order of the day, which we need to be addressing, Mr. Speaker. And so, Mr. Speaker, inflation targeting is not a bad model, but it has problems that we can address. Before we get to addressing these problems entirely, what we need is coordination, policy coordination between monetary policy and fiscal policy. And I thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity.
Yes, Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity. Mr. Speaker, clearly the maker of the statement has demonstrated how monetary policy has not necessarily been very effective in its objective of dealing with inflation. Mr. Speaker, I would like to highlight this, that if you look at the basket of goods and services for the determination of inflation, we have health, we have education, we have food, we have tourism, and all sorts in the basket. Now, if you look at all these in the basket, they are weighted, and food remains a very huge component of the determination of inflation. Therefore, for me, I think it will make a lot of impact if we commit resources, especially to looking at dealing with the element of food cost because of its potential impact on inflation. Because if you look at the other elements within this basket. All the economic factors, interest rate, exchange rate, to some extent play a role on how it impacts them. But I'm more concerned about the food impact because it carries a lot of weight. And therefore, if we put a lot of resources as a country to ensure that food is in abundance, we are making production go on well, and we are reducing our dependence on imported goods. Clearly, on the face of it, we are likely to make an impact straight away. Whilst we are able to deal with issues of collaboration between fiscal and the monetary space so that they are able to work in tandem and get the desired result out of it. So, Mr. Speaker, my simple submission is that we need to really take a close look at the food component of the inflation basket and be able to deal with it like what President Mama is saying about creating farm banks and putting enough investment into agriculture so that we can make the desired impact as far as inflation is concerned. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
If I have to give somebody the opportunity, you have somebody behind you who has been standing for a long time. I think it would be fair for me to do so. Yes, let's listen to you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to contribute to the statement made by my senior colleague, Honorable Stephen Amoah. Mr. Speaker, I will act in accordance with Order 93.5. Mr. Speaker, the economic policy anomaly has an adverse effect on the cost of doing business in Ghana. In attention, it affects the production of which is critical. It affects production which is critical to meet aggregate demand. It affects employment opportunity. Mr. Speaker, it also affects industrial performance. My submission is, I would like to add my voice to the proposal that stakeholders bodies come together to help to help collect the basic but important anomaly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
You want to have the last bite?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, go on.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to contribute to this very important statement. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to contribute to this very important statement by my former boss at Maslock and senior colleague, the Honorable Dr. Stephen Amoah. Mr. Speaker, for all of us who have had the opportunity to sit in economic policy class, it is trite knowledge that the structure of Ghana's economy is it's not balanced, and that it makes it very difficult for any economic policy to be successful, especially ones that are aimed at reducing inflation. And there are several reasons that account for this. Mr. Speaker, from the statement read by the maker of this statement, it is clear that monetary policy has failed to lead to a reduction or downward inflation because of the structure of our economy. And one of the reasons is that monetary policy basically has a delayed impact. In economics that are well structured, monetary policy takes between 6 to 12 months to have a direct impact on the economy. But when you look at the structure of our economy, where there is high deficit and high borrowing and fiscal indiscipline by the central government, it is difficult to control inflation. But how can we solve this problem? Mr. Speaker, there are a number of ways that as a developing country, we can approach this issue and ensure that we resolve the challenges with the structure of our economy. And I am happy that the government only a couple of days ago announced that there will be a national economic forum to assess the structure of Ghana's economy and determine how to change this structure to ensure that development comes to us at a lesser cost and for us to achieve lesser inflation rate than it is now. One of the things that we have to focus on, Mr. Speaker, is for us to improve on import substitution. As we speak today, when you look at our economy, where you import about $1.5 billion worth of rice annually, when we have the capacity to produce enough rice to feed this country. Mr. Speaker, when you import over $850 million of tomatoes from neighboring Burkina Faso, there is no way your monetary policy rate can lead to reducing your inflation. We have to look at local production and how to boost production here in the country to address that challenge. Number two is the issue of cedi depreciation. Mr. Speaker, in the past, we have seen